Today we have a very special guest, Mr. William Murchison, who's a syndicated columnist. He's a columnist and on the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News, the largest paper in Texas, I believe, and one of the founding editors of Texas Republic magazine. He's a regular contributor to two publications that I used to like a lot, the Wall Street Journal and the National Review, and he's the author of his book, Reclaiming Morality in America. And so he is an acknowledged expert in the two things you're not supposed to discuss in polite company, politics and religion. So he is the perfect candidate to speak at the Political Economy Seminar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you our special guest, Mr. William Murchison.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stand up because I find myself constitutionally unable to talk while reposing on my hindquarters, and then I can see more fully anyway what's going on in the room while I talk. And if I see anybody falling asleep, then I'm apt to know it much faster. I appreciate your indulgence in waiting for me to arrive from the Atlanta airport. I arrived shortly after 10 o'clock this morning, and your time, and through the good offices of Mr. Tucker, I got here actually on time. I think to our great surprise, we actually made it. And you were particularly kind to indulge a member of the media quite so far, as this. The profession to which I belong is obviously not the most venerated in America today for reasons that you probably will not have to wonder at. I think according to recent polls, we rank somewhere below trial lawyers in public esteem and slightly above serial murderers. But nonetheless, I have been a member of this distinguished profession, extinguished profession, as some people would prefer, for many years, and I'm probably going to die in harness. I have to say, if nothing else, that we have a record of constancy that exceeds that of politicians. The members of the media at least know what they think. I don't know whether you heard. It should have been today's newspapers that Senator Dole has now called for reversing Roe versus Wade. He wants to call it Wade versus Roe. Just about what we might expect. But thank you for being here today. It's an honor to be on the campus of Auburn University. It's an honor to be here in connection with the distinguished Ludwig von Mises Institute and I'm glad to see Lou Rockwell walk in, and a gentleman whose writing I have admired, and whose public persona I've admired for a lot of years, and I'm grateful for the association with the von Mises Institute that I've had through not only my appearance here, but through the Freeman for your publication, for which whose name escapes me for the moment. The Free Market. The Freeman is the other publication. All right. I wanted to make a few remarks today about American culture, and I want to do this in the context of the topic that is probably on most people's minds because of the episode in Oklahoma City. I want to see if I can put this in a context that might be helpful to us. I think that as we have surveyed the ghastly damage that has occurred in Oklahoma City, it's scarcely 2 weeks now since the bombing, but it's become a feature of the landscape, and we ask ourselves, what kind of country is this? What kind of country is it that makes it possible for a building in which hundreds of people are doing their business in a peaceful manner to be destroyed, these lives snuffed out, including the lives of young children, babies? What kind of country are we that makes it possible for something like this to happen? I think it's a good question, but I don't think it exhausts the rhetorical possibilities. I think we could ask ourselves other questions of the same genre. We could ask ourselves, for example, what kind of country is it in which the federal government sends tanks into an area inhabited not only by armed men, but by unarmed women and children? We could ask ourselves, what kind of country is it whose president, a self-confessed adulterer and evader of the selective service system, when he seeks to reform public health care, proposes for us nothing less than the kind of bureaucracy that would have gladdened the hearts of any Soviet apparat in the good old days of the Iron Curtain. What kind of country is it, we might ask, that for the sake of eliminating racial discrimination proposes to enforce another kind of racial discrimination? Different races, different forms of discrimination. What kind of country is it that perpetually spends more than it takes in, with a bottomless appetite, seemingly, for the creation of, or the beefing up of government programs that in fact turn out to be programs not so much for the easing of social tensions as for the buying of votes? What kind of country is it that allows the snuffing out each year of 1.5 million lives through abortion, all constitutionally approved by the U.S. Supreme Court, and yet will not allow in its public schools the expression of religious opinion on this or any other question? What kind of country is it? Well, it's a nation very much like our own, the United States of America in 1995. The Oklahoma City catastrophe has called forth the analytical resources of my profession to a degree probably you have not witnessed in years. What does it mean? Oh, tell us, wise men of the media. Oh, tell us, talk show hosts, what does it all mean? How are we to make sense of it? What must we do? What must we do to avoid repetitions? And so now we have proposals that the Federal Bureau of Investigation must be empowered to look into the lives of Americans with much more diligence than ever before. That the federal apparatus must be given heightened powers to survey groups that may be planning more actions like this, that may have dark designs that we do not even yet suspect. We know now, we strongly suspect that the measure that would be coming up in Congress, that would have been coming up in Congress in recent times to repeal the ban on assault weapons, is probably dead for this year. Because we live in a climate in which we cannot contemplate the broadening of liberties, but we must rather think of their contraction. So I fully expect during the course of the debate for someone, because of the nature of the deadly instrument in Oklahoma City, I fully expect for a coalition of senators and representatives to call for a federal ban on fertilizer. Of course, that we might not have such a ban because it would deprive congressmen of their most striking rhetorical weapons. Nonetheless, what I think we ought to be thinking about is not so much the contraction of liberty, perhaps not even so much as its expansion in this time, as a fundamental rethinking of our culture. The culture of our country in 1995. The primary problem today, as I see it, is not people bombing buildings. It's people wanting to bomb buildings, desiring to inflict injury on other people, not asking themselves the signal and essential questions: is it right or is it wrong? Is it good or is it evil? But acting upon their impulses and their instincts in the way that they have been conditioned to do by the cultural influences that surround them, in which we live, in which we bathe daily. There's a vital distinction between bombing and wanting to bomb. And the distinction lies in the putting of those questions. Is it right or is it wrong? What kind of order do we live in today that makes it possible to contemplate the extinction of hundreds of innocent lives in the bombing of a building? We live not so much in a culture of order of any kind. We live in a culture of disorder, of moral and social and cultural disorder. We have lost the moral understanding that we had for so many years in our country. That we have, in fact, boasted about, part of our proud inheritance as Westerners, the understanding of our place in the moral universe. A sense of right and wrong and good and evil used to underlie and to undergird the culture. It made America what it was. It made the West what it was. And that sense no longer unites us. In fact, the recognition of that sense of right and wrong and good and evil has become in many people's eyes a kind of a badge of an antique understanding and a repressive mindset. As if to say, I know what you ought to be doing. And what's more, I have every intention of enforcing that knowledge upon you. That's the stereotypical understanding of what we used to mean by a moral culture. A culture in which ordinary people, not the intellectuals, not just the clergy, and not just the politicians, but ordinary people, understood and acted upon moral principles. It seems to me that our understanding of morality, our sense of what it is, and what we ought to be doing as moral people, has reached its low point in American society. I'm a little loath, as a trained historian. That's actually what I set out to be before I wandered into this debased profession of journalism. I received all my degrees in my major coursework in history, and then found other employment. But I've always found employment of a sort from my historical knowledge, because it has made me, among other things, skeptical of comparing one historical era to another and striving for exact measurements. But I think it's safe enough to see that the American moral understanding, this unitive force behind our culture, is mostly today unattended and neglected. It no longer binds us together. It no longer serves as a force for action and a caution against the wrong kinds of action. Morality, we have come to understand in our time as a bad thing. Now that's an extraordinary revelation, if you call it a revelation on the part of modern people, that morality is bad. What do we think of moral people as doing? What do we think of morality as being? We think of moral people as being usually people of rather elderly cast of mind, who sit around, they all have to be male too, sitting around wringing their hands over the younger generation and the healthy pursuits that they're engaging in, and thinking of ways to thwart them, to make them as unhappy as we possibly can. And morality, our misunderstanding, embodies the code that these people, unasked for, unrequested, try to impose on the rest of us. Morality, viewed in this way, is what a few unhappy people try to do to the vastly happy majority, to drag them down to their own level. That's not so. It never was so. It never has been so, no matter how our culture may protest. Morality is best viewed, and the reason that I indulge in this question and ask you indulgence for my emphasis on these questions is that I have recently, as you heard in the introduction, written a book called Reclaiming Morality in America. And I try to define morality in a way that to me is persuasive to people who accept organized religion, accept the tenets of the Christian faith or the Jewish faith, or indeed of another religion altogether, but also for those who think that there needs to be a rational basis for morality, other than the thunderous voice from the mountaintop saying, "Thou shalt not." There is this element to the traditional morality that we have embraced as Westerners, but it has a rational basis to it. It's a question of who we are, where we came from, and what we're to do while we're in this world. Who we are, where we came from, and what we do. You might call it, if you were inclined to do so, the owner's manual for the human body and spirit. Morality speaks to that which enhances man's place in this world, brings out the highest and the noblest. And you know, when I speak of man, I'm speaking generically. I have to make that apology these days in modern times, because if I say man, people will sometimes ask, "Well, what about women?" and I'm speaking of man and woman together. And I'm speaking of man and woman together in a way that traditional morality understands as fundamental to our place in life. Man and woman is made for each other, and not as antagonists, but as the essential units of our society, made for each other, and therefore called on to live in a relationship where each honors the other, a relationship that leads to the formation of families and the procreation of life, and that's based on fidelity, lifelong fidelity, each to the other, a commitment that provides a level of happiness and health, as even the medical doctors will tell us today, that is not reachable in other relationships. This is one aspect of morality. It is living the life for which we were created, understanding the instincts and the impulses and the temptations that we have, and then putting reins on the worst of those temptations, and sometimes the best of those temptations, and striving to live in a just and an honorable and a decent and a virtuous manner, because as we practice justice and virtue and decency, we obtain the highest happiness. And we know this through the testimony not only of our parents and our grandparents, but through the great corpus of Western literature, through that great book, which we can't have in schoolrooms anymore because the federal government has told us not to, the Holy Bible. We understand it through the songs and the legends and the bedtime stories, that the prayers that are part of our culture, that are part of this great warp and woof of Western culture. That's much more than a series of forbidding titles in the Centopicon that are a part of our way of life. We understand this. We know this. We know that justice and virtue and mercy and truth are good for us, even if we must die for them, as occasionally we must. Our culture has taught us this. And yet the great irony is that the culture of the West today has become despised, downtrodden, reviled. The culture that invented democracy, the culture that invented freedom, the culture that is the most inspired of all by religious truth, is reviled because of certain offenses that it is alleged to have created against particular members, women or blacks or ethnic minorities of one sort or another, Indians. That's particularly popular nowadays. The culture of the West is said to have brought nothing but suffering and hardship to these people, and therefore we have to reject it. And all the songs and the stories and the poems and the legends that tell us about justice and truth and harmony and go out the window. And we are to strive for a new understanding. What is that understanding to be composed of? What's to make it up? That understanding is to be made up of our personal intuitions. That has been the downfall of our moral understanding in the 20th century. The impulse to make it all up as we go, to substitute for the great tradition of Western society our personal insights. We substituted what I call the horizontal view of life. We have put it in place of what I call the vertical view of life. The vertical view, what was it? It was the upward glance toward authority, toward God, at the top of the authority scale. God was a word that we didn't used to shrink from using in public discourse at an earlier time in our past. But in any case, we saw life as structured in a vertical sense. Some things being better than other things. Some things being ipso facto inferior to other things, and therefore not to be grasped or to be appropriated. Differentiated. A structure of value. What do we have today? What have we replaced it with? We've replaced it with a culture that we imported from political democracy. Political democracy, do not mistake me, has been a good thing for this country. It has given us the freest government in the history of mankind. But when we imported political democracy from the political realm to the cultural realm, then we began to treat values in the way that we treated political candidates. Each equal to a claim on our affections and our hopes and our aspirations. Each having an equal claim on us. All values being alike. The horizontal view is the name that I have given to this view because everything seems to be on the same plane. We look left, we look right, we look behind us, we look ahead of us, and we see people doing particular things. And we say, oh, how nice, how wonderful, how enjoyable for them. Why can't I do as well? Why can't I likewise seek to do what I want to do in my personal sphere? And so I will. And I'll do whatever I want to do. The do it culture. Ah, yes, do it. The name of that paradigmatic 1970s book by Jerry Rubin, which had an exclamation point at the end of the title, as I recall. Do it. Do whatever you want to do, so long as you enjoy doing it. Interesting thing about Jerry Rubin, because he was crossing a freeway in Los Angeles recently, was struck by an automobile. He was crossing against the light, jaywalking, and was struck by a car, and died of a cerebral hemorrhage several days later doing it. I think a rather graphic illustration of the point that I made about the beneficial aspects of morality. As we obey the moral law, we thrive, or at least we die with honor. As we disregard it, we sink lower and lower and lower, and finally expire in the morass of our failed aspirations. What's happened basically is that we've gone from a vertical view of life to a horizontal view, and that our teaching institutions The institutions that are supposed to impart value to us, to pass on the norms and the traditions of the human race, have likewise taken up, to a great and dismaying extent, this horizontal view. There are three principal teaching institutions on which we rely for the imparting of norms and standards. They are the schools, the church, and the family. And each, in its own way, has failed. The public schools which now educate the vast majority of American students, have become institutions not so much for the imparting of knowledge, and certainly not for the imparting of values, but for the kind of feel-good acculturation that our society seems to demand now. Multiculturalism and pluralism and sex education and socialization, not to mention keeping kids off the street who might be robbing 7-Elevens if they were left to their own devices. All these missions the public schools have taken up because our society has decided that the schools, in fact, had a mission that went far beyond simple imparting of facts and truths. The churches entered in the 1960s, and even before that, if you want to take it back in a historical sense to the 1890s, you most assuredly can do that too. But the churches entered upon a time when the teaching of the gospel and the propounding of religious truth became less important than the solution of what were deemed to be intractable social problems. Poverty and crime and war. The church sought to make a place for itself in the world by propounding what it thought were religious solutions to human problems, but which turned out mostly to be sociological approaches to these problems. And the churches, as they grew farther from the as they retreated from their historic duty of propounding religious truth, became less and less consequential in day-to-day activity. So that you found churchmen frequently who wanted to be thought of as relevant, adopting the most extreme and extraordinary positions, saying things that you never thought that they would say, because the churches have been imparters of truth, divinely revealed truth, and yet you will find clergymen throughout America today, throughout Western culture, encouraging people to do whatever they want to do in the name of their individual destiny, or their inner child, or whatever. Such is the lowly estate to which the churches have brought themselves. But the family itself has been disqualified to a great extent as a teaching institution by the simple dissolution of families, which has been encouraged by the culture. Divorce has been the great solvent. The idea has been that no longer is marriage a lifetime covenant, but rather an arrangement that we enjoy and enter into so long. And this was one of the 1960s formulations that people put in their marriage ceremonies. So long as love shall last. So long as love shall last. Which is a very extraordinary thing to say, because people fall out of love day by day. But the people who deeply love seem to move beyond that and to forgive and to move onward to a higher plateau of love than these daily interruptions of affection seem to make possible. But the family is dissolved. Single mothers have taken up the job, in many cases, that was designed for two parents. The education, the faithful rearing of children, and it becomes impossible then for the family to do an effective job, even when the family isn't inclined to do so. It becomes very difficult for the family to carry on the job of training. The poor single mother comes in at the end of the day. Sometimes all she can do is put food on the table and make sure the homework is done and the lights turned out at bedtime. Don't call on her to impart moral teaching. But the family has been disabled by the trends of the times. And so our three great teaching institutions, churches, schools, and family, are no longer teaching the great truths of the West. What's our hope? Our hope in these times is for a reopening of moral debate. And I think that's going on. I think it's commencing. I've been very pleased by the reception that my book on morality has gotten, but I'm not the only author writing about morality today. Even Time magazine and Newsweek, which went through about 20 years after certainly Time magazine did after the death of Henry Luce, went through a time when it thought that nothing could be sillier than the examination of moral questions. Even these news magazines are reacquainting themselves with the desire for and the need for an understanding of moral truth. Most of all, I think what is necessary is the rediscovery in our time of God and of His benevolent purposes. A religious conversion could fix this country faster than anything else could possibly do. Far faster than any presidential election. The problems of our day will not be solved by politicians. They won't be solved by journalists. I'll tell you that. The finest and the most pointed psalm that I know of in the Bible is this one, from which I quote just a few words. "Oh, put not your trust in princes, or in any child of man, for there is no help in them." Oh, put not your trust in princes. I've never heard better political advice in my life. Of course, our modern day princes, who are politicians, can't acknowledge that. They can't acknowledge something that is to be found in a book that the Supreme Court says cannot be lawfully admitted to a public school classroom, or from which a quotation might be used at a public function on taxpayer-sponsored premises. So to find this book, you go to your bookshelf at home. You go to the place where books like this came from, the church. Or you go when all else fails to the nightstand in your motel. But you go. The reformation of our culture is the great task facing us today. Far, far greater than the reformation of our economy, of our political structure. Mute testimony to this are those ghastly pieces of rubble in Oklahoma City, the work of people who have forgotten God, and we must not forget. We must not forget Him, and we must not forget what those who have forgotten Him have done. And now, I think I've used up the allotted 30 minutes, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Well,
John? Speaking for maybe the other reviled profession you mentioned, the lawyers. The trial lawyers especially are under great attack. And I'd be interested in your comments about this observation. In the Chronicle on Higher Education back in 1988, it reprinted a graduation address by an attorney at Cornell University. And he'd been practicing law 50 years, and he said that he regretted the public image of lawyers now, as they are perceived correctly as being mainly in a business rather than a profession. And he laid the blame on our culture and also on higher education in general in preparing lawyers. And he was speaking of the culture in general, but lawyers in particular.
Right.
He said that people in charge of higher education in the 19th century recognized that higher education, college education, was primary for doctors, lawyers, preachers, and teachers, and the guardian sort of the public trust of freedom. And he said that the purpose of a higher education in the 19th century was based on the realization that you could have a free people only if you had a virtuous people, and that the teaching in the undergraduate level should be on those 2 points, virtue and freedom. And you get a classical education in doing that. And that what should be recognized is that lawyers can learn more from great novels about people and their virtue and their freedom than they can in a lot of law books. And he thought that our culture that higher education has more responsibility for bringing about a change in our culture to restore virtue and freedom than maybe other elements.
I think that's wonderfully said. I couldn't agree more with that. The legal profession is an excellent example of the corruption that our culture has inflicted on those institutions that we expect to be guardians of our culture. The lawyer was a guardian, and it really wasn't all that long ago that lawyers were guardians of our culture. I proposed myself in high school and in my very early years in college to become a lawyer, and I thought better of it, and as I say, trained as a historian instead. But I well remember that the legal profession in those days was not a business. It was regarded as to some degree, by the lawyers in my town, my rather small Texas town, as a trust, which did well by some members and less well by others, but which nevertheless transcended individual aspiration. It was a very high trust. To go into the kind of teaching that you have reference to is a difficult thing, because we have to persuade people to do that kind of teaching. But I agree with you. I very much agree with the point that higher education has a duty to teach virtue, and that as it fails to do so, then it has to accept a share of the blame for the lack of virtue in our present-day society. Education is a central thing. Education at all levels is the problem. The schools, the churches, the families. Virtue is a kind of, excuse me, the love of virtue there's a kind of instinct that rational human beings seem to have engrafted in most of them at birth. But that instinct will be dormant unless it's treated like a fragile plant and watered and tended and given sunshine. And that's the task of education. So I very much endorse the point that you made.
Leland?
Mr. Murchison, I think you're magnificently right about the great damage being done by trends and fashions that undercut morality. My question has to do with whether we should look to religion for restoration. Because if you tell people that religion is the key to the way out, I think you've got to tell them that the doctrines of religion are in fact true. It won't work to tell them that it would be convenient if they were true, or it would be convenient if you thought they were true. You've got to be able to tell them that the doctrines of religion are true. And then it becomes important to figure out which doctrines are true, because you can't make a compromise really between Islam and Judaism and Christianity. In important respects, they're saying different things. For example, the divinity and redemptive mission of Christ is not just a detail which we can accommodate to among different religions. So that's really my question: which particular religious doctrines are the true?
As a Christian, if you call Episcopalianism Christian, which it is on rare and random occasions, as a Christian, I am more than willing that Muslims should teach the validity of their faith. I'm more than willing that Jews should teach the validity of their faith. But I simply expect Christian ministers and pastors and priests likewise to have as high concern for the validity of their faith, which I happen to believe is true. I think that the great flaw of religion in our present time, the religious establishment, has been to see essentially all religions on the same par. It's gotten so bad in the Episcopal Church that now we're not even supposed to talk about evangelization of people who are not Christian. We're supposed to we purged the missionary hymns out of our last hymnal to Greenland's icy mountain and Afric's sunny shore. We're not supposed to talk about taking the gospel to the heathen. we're supposed to talk only about offering an interesting and appealing alternative to people who don't find it somewhere else. That is blasphemy, in my estimation. And the question that you ask, which truth is valid, is unanswerable, except at the individual level. By which I mean that each seeker must decide which religion best reflects his perceptions of the truth. But the question then begins. The question then becomes one of how we inspire the religious establishment to offer a version of truth, as opposed to simple alternatives, and to make those versions enticing and attractive and appealing. And we have to get the churches past this very 1960s horizontal way of thinking. But I think that will happen. Not because I, as a layman, will have any effect, or the media, God help us, will have any effect, or the politicians, but rather because the church is not of man. The church is under God, and He will have the say in what happens to the church. Question? Yes.
Just as an interesting footnote to what you just said, C.S. Lewis, in his Abolition of Man and His Appendices, says that there's a lot of commonality between these major religions, whether they're from the Far East or they're from the Christian West. There's a commonality of virtue and a commonality of the difference between what is right and what is wrong. And in today's society, we don't even have that commonality. We can't say that is for certain wrong to do.
Right. Some things are better than other things, and that some things are right and other things are wrong. We're politically incorrect, or we're reactionary if we express an opinion, and we're certainly repressive. There is one of the most deadly words of the American left: repressive. My goodness, we don't want to do anything that the liberal media might construe as repressive, such as express the judgment that something is better than something else. But you're right, that commonality of our culture has been missing for a very long time. Yes.
The media has been celebrating the 20th anniversary of the downfall of Vietnam. Do you think the Vietnam War and segregation were responsible for the success or takeover of the liberal philosophy and that sort of thing?
Yes, I do to a great extent, because I think that the civil rights battle of the 1950s was one that I think encouraged Americans to think of government in a friendlier way than they had thought of it up to that time. Of course, the New Deal was fundamental there too. But I think Americans came to see government as indispensable in the process of establishing justice, and I think they came also to think of action in the streets as being conducive to the realization of the standard of justice. They also, because many of the people who participated in Vietnam protests had grown up in the civil rights demonstrations, there was a certain continuity there between civil rights and Vietnam, and we were for peace and justice. And I remember I grew up in this time. I'm 53 years old. I graduated from college in 1963, and I can well recall sitting around listening to Peter, Paul, and Mary strumming their guitars and telling us about what was blowing in the wind and where the answer my friend was, and Vietnam and civil rights all fit together. It was all part of the same touchy-feely. I'm not denigrating the civil rights movement, by the way. As a Southerner, as a Texan, I can say that state-sponsored segregation was wrong, and that it needed to be got rid of. But I'm saying that some of the cultural influences that came from this time likewise fed the sort of touchy feelings of the 1960s, and so So, and I think also that we were experiencing cultural breakdown simply from it had been going on throughout the century. It had been going on in the 1920s. It would have gone on in the 30s if it had been for the Depression. It would have gone on in the 40s had it not been for World War II. I think it started a long time, actually, before Vietnam and the civil rights demonstrations, and I'd take it back to the Enlightenment. And I could even make, if I had another hour or two, I'd make the case for the Renaissance and the Reformation being the great seed beds of our modern calamities. But how so be it? That's probably time for another question. Yeah, this is for.
Yeah, please go. Well, you talk about the media being a source of a lot of the blame for the problems we have today. I was wondering if you could comment on the new media as being part of the solutions.
The new media, the talk radio shows and such?
Talk radio, electronic media, computers.
Yeah.
Traditional newspaper readership's been going down, and higher demand for those. Yeah,
I'm painfully aware of our declining readership. That's something that Jeff Tucker and I were talking about in the car over here. 71% of Americans read newspapers in 1961. It's down to about 60% right now, and it's on the decline. And that's not even counting the gap between Sunday readership and weekly readership. But I think that's part of the failure of the media as part of the culture, to present something that's useful, that the culture needs and wants, whether it knows or not, whether or not it knows that it needs and wants these things. The rise of talk radio and the rise of non-traditional newspapers has been a response, I think, to the blindness and the obtusity of the establishment media. We have been extremely obtuse. We don't care what our readers want anymore. We sit around in small conversational knots, and we decide what they want, and we make a list. And then we make sure that our editors get the word, and that's what we give them. And if the readers don't want it, the viewers don't want it, well, those poor boobs, that's their problem, not ours. It's their fault for not wanting what we say they ought to want. But I think that here, in the case of talk radio and other non-traditional media, you've got the good old marketplace working. God bless the marketplace. I know I can get by with saying that at the Von Mises Institute.
No place else, though.
I just wanted one more comment. I watched on C-SPAN, a good medium.
Yes.
Senator Shelby, in charge of the committee, did you see this, to investigate and do some investigations about increasing security at federal buildings? And he had the man in charge of General Services Administration. My point is just to underscore one of your points. He talked in particular about the great need for great security of child care facilities in buildings. And he talked about the many aspects of kidnappers, of children getting lost, of diseases, of these things, and how they were going to increase it until they had excellent child care. But I thought to myself, the best child care is to let the mama stay home and take care of that child. You'll never equal that.
You are right. You are right. So you're interposing a cultural answer to a political problem. You're doing exactly what I've been advocating today. That's the problem is not the security of the child care facility at the federal building. The problem is the growing tendency of families just to put children at the mercy of whatever child care facility happens to be there to look after their children. Nobody can substitute the love and the affection and the wisdom of the mother with her children. You simply can't replace it. And unfortunately, we have replaced it in our time with the child care facility. I'm not. This is not a personal attack on people who, for economic reasons, have to have both parents working, and therefore have to have the children in some facility or the other. But it's not the ideal.
Well, my point is also that the mother is being forced into the marketplace in many instances.
Right. That's exactly right.
It's not her choice.
Yes.
To follow along in the same way, the demise of in loco parentis on the college campus has had a detrimental effect on all the character building aspects of higher education.
Right. Couldn't agree more.
Stuart,
Your time.
you have time for one more question.
Okay. I mean, it seems to me a lot of these things that you're bringing up are economic actors acting in their own rational self-interest. I mean, divorce is two people that are married that don't see it in their interest to be married anymore. The church has altered their structure. It seems to be that the church has made a rational decision that it's in their self-interest to do so. Childcare is just a rational decision to pay enough money to have somebody take care of the children so that you can enter the marketplace and work. How do you see those things being altered by bringing the church back? This is to a certain extent, this is economic progress, giving people more choices, allowing them to decide for themselves how these things should be resolved.
No, you're right. The people are behaving as economic actors. The problem is that they're not doing it as I suggest they ought to in a cultural context. Every economic decision has got non-economic consequences. And I think that a lot of the decisions to which you refer are made without thought for anything but economic advantage. We have to see those decisions as being made in the context of our humanity and our relationships with other people, with our spouses, our children, our communities, our churches. And we've destroyed our culture, we've semi-destroyed our culture in our time. So it's very hard for people to act other than, as you suggest they do, as economic actors. If we rebuild the culture, if we manage to rebuild the culture through the intervention of the churches and families and schools, and that's very difficult to do, then people, when they do behave as economic actors, will look beyond the purely economic decisions. And they will evaluate those decisions in terms of their effects on other aspects of life, not just the economic aspects of life.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.